Chapter 26, The Final Battle. The 1,331-year-old man named Hecate Riley walked among his militia, chatting with several of the new captains as he passed. He saw the building of the fort that was being prepared 10 miles away from the entrance to his father's land, where they would attack the Dark Lord's personal stronghold. Walking through the area, the Omegan thought about recent events that had brought them to this final confrontation with his father's forces. They had successfully taken Cassius's high-walled mansion in the fortress town of Silurhune, deep within the eastern mountains, 3 months ago, and had hounded the high commander and his personal guard, all who had escaped from the large skirmish. He and the resistance force he commanded had fought their way deep into the northern forest, chasing the blocked warrior legion all the way back to the Dark Lord's very fortress. This was a land where Hecate himself had once lived and commanded all of his father's militia at an earlier time in the land's history. Walking around the new defensive fort, the general checked their fortifications, and his cybernetic mind ran through various points of weakness and how they might further shore up their defenses. As he walked, he saw Colonel Jacen speaking to Captain Hope as they headed over to a large contingent of 150 archers. With his cybernetic vision, he looked upon the archers, all wearing the special armors and carrying the mechanical bows that fired the flared bolts of his brother's exceptional design. He could see Romero's runes glinting on the stocks of each of the weapons and saw the special armor that was designed to allow for haste in movement. As he had so many times before, Hecate shook his head in wonder at his brother's expertise in armorcraft. In addition to the enhanced armor and weapons, each resistance member had been provided with several tools they each wore on a utility belt. The toolkit contained a basic fire starter, medical supplies, a powerful miniaturized folding telescope, and most importantly, a lightweight communication system that allowed for encrypted close-range communications. It had taken some time for the militia to become used to the communicator technology. Hecate realized these devices were likely seen as magic by everyone. None of them had ever seen electricity before and were amazed they could speak to each other through the small devices that were attached to the wrist with a strap that conformed perfectly to the wearer's skin. Just then, Hecate's finely honed hearing picked up the trilling commands from the cavalry and looked over to see Colonel Cerberus. The tall man was riding one of his favorite wrapped horses and leading a contingent of cavalry over to billet their animals, where they would prepare for the upcoming attack that was planned at dawn. Hecate looked around at the 800 infantry they had recruited and trained as the men and women went about their specific duties, setting up the fort and the nearby outlier campsites. Many of the captains were men or women that had remained since the first battle to defend the tavern. Each of the many militia members collected a monthly salary that was provided by Hecate. Many others were recruits from several prison quarries they had liberated soon after the loss of the tavern. With perfect eidetic memory, Hecate played back the time they had freed the prisoners. Together with Hecate and the other commanders of the resistance force, Jacen had led a raid on one of the prison colonies late one night. Jacen was chosen to lead the mission as he had first-hand knowledge of the inside of the prison. Wearing the special armor and weapons that had been provided by Romero, their growing resistance had swept over the prison in the darkness of night, slaying all the prison guards and releasing the prisoners. Jacen had addressed the prisoners as they were fed and clothed by Hecate and the others. Speaking in an impassioned voice, Jacen stood up on a small pile of rocks and addressed the throng of stone millers that had recently been prisoners. He had said, "If you are a man or woman whose life has been harmed by the Dark Lord or by his injustice in this land, join us, and we will train you to fight back against him." Many of the tired prisoners had looked up at the young and powerful-looking man in his glimmering red and orange-colored armor with interest as others began walking away into the forest. Jacen spoke with those who had remained to listen and soon had divided the interested parties into platoons who were supplied with the armor and short sword of Romero's design. As the months had moved on, their numbers had continued to grow from the many villagers and farmers who had joined the fight. Many had taken up the firebrand initiated by Euclidean and Chino, who moved from village to town and had spread the invitation to join with the resistance. The growing group had quickly set up a fallback headquarters at the liberated prison quarry and began training individuals in various combat techniques. Those that could ride a wrapped horse were trained into the cavalry that was led by Cerberus. Many showed a strong aptitude in archery and were turned over to Jacen to add to her archery force. Most showed promise as infantry and were trained by Hecate, Jacen, and Darstad. Certain individuals were selected from this group to become further trained by Hecate and Jacen into a special elite force Jacen would command. In the last 2 years, Hecate had artfully created training opportunities by organizing hit-and-run skirmishes against small platoons of Black Warriors. These skirmishes were quite successful, with Romero's armors providing the edge that was needed to overcome the superior numbers of the Black Warrior Legion. To aid in their success against the Black Warriors, an agreement had been arranged with several leaders of the mutant-plagued tribes. The mutants had agreed to further hound anyone who entered their land in pursuit of the resistance force. The months had quickly joined together, and now it was 2 years since the Battle of the Tavern. Romero had continued to bring more armor, supplies, and weapons over the many months. Hecate watched as 2 small cannons were lined up near a paddock of livestock, along with their special projectile canisters that were placed in protective metal canisters at the base of each weapon. While somewhat bulky, the cannon had been instrumental in several of the larger skirmishes to quickly cut into the enemy force. Romero had not approved of the weapons and had erupted into an emotional outburst with Hecate for building the cannons, arguing that guns of any sort would only result in more violence in the future. Hecate privately disagreed with his brother, but had committed to dismantle the weapons after the last battle. Romero had reluctantly agreed, and had selected a mortar group that had been trained in the use of the 2 powerful projectile weapons. Hecate reviewed the argument with his brother as he glanced over to the munitions tent that was set up and guarded by 10 men. Within the thick curtains of the tent were additional backup weapons, as well as the entire camp's supply of the special thrown explosives Romero had created. The explosives were deadly and created huge pockets of impact trauma to anyone that was caught in the blast. Hecate noticed Benny walking around the tent and speaking with the guards. Often the guards would chuckle in genuine companionship with the boy, who had grown taller and wore the special dark leather armor that Marvin had supplied him those years ago. The general continued his walk and checked in with an aide to see if there was word from Jacen or Darstad. He had sent his 2 colonels on a mission to recruit specialty fighters for their upcoming attack. Jacen was sent to 3 locations in the eastern forest to speak with several occultists. Hecate hoped an agreement could be reached for their special kind of help for the upcoming encounter. With his personal guard of 20 elite infantrymen, Jacen and his men had ridden off on a group of raft horses 3 days ago, set upon the mission. Darstad had been sent as an emissary of the resistance to the outlying mutant plague towns. Hecate planned to reaffirm their previous agreements and to offer a special incentive to join their final attack. He hoped to entice the large humanoids to fight in the upcoming battle alongside his men. Their prodigious strength would be a boon to their defenses. Darstad had set off with his own contingent of infantry, and neither colonel had yet to return. Hecate's quick mind calculated the changes in the plan of attack that was set for dawn of the next day should the men not return at the appointed time. Darstad and a platoon of 20 rode their raft horses up to the mutant camp alongside the lake. Before leaving, his lover Jacen had told him the story of how the old bounty hunter Euclidean had fought the tribe's leader and had won passage through the lands on the rescue mission they had been on. The resistance colonel brought his men to a halt and climbed off his raft horse. A group of the cancer-ridden mutants approached Darstad, being led by a man who was extremely muscled and apparently the leader. The 3 mutants, each covered in the unsightly sores that marked them as plague carriers, walked up to stand a bit apace from the group of militiamen. Darstad motioned to his men, who carried over a large chest filled with gold and silver. "Payment for another year," said Darstad. The mutant leader motioned to his men, who stepped forward and accepted the chest. He walked up to Darstad and said, "We take money. Hinder the Dark Warriors in our land for 1 more year." He spat into his hand, and Darstad did likewise, and they shook in the custom of the day to seal a deal. As the mutant leader turned to follow the men carrying the gold and silver, Darstad spoke again, making sure to speak loud enough for the other mutants to hear. "General Hecate has a special offer for you and your men. If any warrior comes to fight with him at dawn in 2 days, he will give each of them and their family members the cure to the plague." The leader froze in his steps, as did the mutants carrying the chest, and all turned to slowly look at the man in wonder. "How'll he do this?" asked the leader in a disbelieving tone. Darstad said, "He has a way, and I have made this same offer to other tribes of your people. Others of your kind will come, and any who fight will be cured forever." The mutant leader turned away and began excitedly speaking with the other 2 guards with him as Darstad returned to his raft horse and gave the motion to his men to move out. It was a 14-hour journey of hard riding to reach the rendezvous with Jacen, where Romero's craft would arrive to take he and their men back to the upcoming battle. With haste, Darstad began the long ride as the mutants watched them leave. The muscled men had become motionless in their imaginings of being free of the plague forever. Colonel Jacen of the Resistance walked his rapt horse to the edge of the old path in the forest he recognized. He was reminded of the strange escape from the witch woman he had encountered 2 years ago. He had taken off his glimmering armor and wore a simple leather tunic and trews, but carried his staff weapon with him. General Hecate had sent he and his personal guard into the western forest to contact several people that he had encountered in his travels over the many years. Jacen had successfully contacted the other 4 occult chieftains and had made the offer from Hecate. For those that brought aid into the upcoming battle, each tribe's leader would be a recognized voice in the new Council of Chiefs that would be set up after the Dark Lord had fallen. The new Council of Chiefs would decide the best way to build trade throughout the forest for the building up their civilizations. Jacen stretched his tired muscles from riding in the saddle so long. He had ordered his personal guard to set up camp at a nearby clearing 1 mile away from the path he now walked upon. As he approached the section of earth that had once burst open, he noticed the small cabin appeared much as it had been before. He could see the door he had yanked open in his run to escape and noticed it was now closed. Jacen had saved this visit for last, for he did not know what to expect. He approached the cabin with a measure of disquiet and stopped in his walk to momentarily lean into his sense of demonic energies. In a moment of dark vision, Jacen saw the house as if it were covered by a shadowy and bloated mass of jelly that pulsated in some malevolent fashion. He shook his head clear of the vision, swallowed, and approached the wooden door. As he had passed the threshold of the dark mass he had encountered a moment before, he felt as if he had entered a different atmosphere, a darker one with shadows in every corner. Jacen noticed his pulse in his throat as he stepped up onto the darkened porch and knocked upon the door to the cabin. It opened slowly, and a brim of smoky vapor billowed out at him as the witch stood before him. She wore a loose and silky slip that was made of some soft platinum-colored silky material. The garment covered her from her neckline down. She looked at Jacen, and her eyes were slit and unfocused as she gazed upon him. "Good tidings, fine travelers," whispered the witch in a drunken way. She leaned on the doorframe in a seductive manner, and the hem of her slip rode up to reveal the line of her finely toned body as she rested her bare foot upon the doorframe. Jacen realized the witch was drunk and did not recognize him for the moment. He said to her, "I am Colonel Jacen of the Resistance, and have come to request your aid from our leader, General Hecate." The witch listened to his words, then hissed, "Hecate!" and spat on the ground before she turned her back to face the interior of the cabin. Jacen quickly continued, "My general sends his warm regards and asks for your aid." He quickly outlined the offer of the new council, and the witch woman started chuckling as she bent over to pluck a bug up from the ground. "Hecate, so differently he speaks," she said as she looked upon the beetle crawling upon her hand. She looked over to Jacen and said, "I agree, save your promise to thee." Jacen paused, and licking his lips to moisten them in the musty air, he asked, "What promise?" The witch walked over to him and pressed her body up against his in a close embrace. "To bed with thee," whispered the witch woman as she kissed Jacen with wet lips. Jacen kissed her back, then roughly grabbed her by the arms and pulled the slip away from her small form. The witch pressed her naked body onto his as she kissed him with dark passion and pulled at his clothing. A jagged scar could be seen across her abdomen as a dark reminder from their first encounter. Jacen pulled his clothing away as he pushed her into the interior of the cabin and shut the door. As he hastily pulled at his clothing, he noticed the interior was mostly as it was before, with the carpet in front of the fire and a smoky incense wafting upon the musty air currents within. Jacen placed his staff and clothing onto the floor, and the witch fell to her knees and began filleting him. He moaned in pleasure and was about to grab her when suddenly his senses screamed out to him, and he pulled himself out of her mouth and jumped backwards, just as she swiped a stone knife at his inner thigh. Jacen felt his thigh and saw that she had just barely scraped him and would have cut away his testicles had he not jumped backwards. The witch stood up and cackled at his horrified expression. As she did, a line of spittle ran down her mouth to drip onto her chest and the floor. Her eyes were clear and bright as she spoke to him. "Remember you well, I do, fine traveler," she said as she slowly walked toward Jacen, who had hastily drawn up his pants and was searching for something he could grab to use as a weapon. As the witch came upon him, she suddenly darted out and stabbed at Jacen. Jacen nimbly jumped out of the arc of her stone knife, then grabbed her and pinned her arm behind her, making her drop the stone knife onto the cabin floor. The witch breathed like a wild cat and struggled under Jacen's embrace. He easily held her to him as she struggled, and after a moment, she stopped, only to heave large breaths into and out of her lungs. Jacen held the heaving woman to him, and her sweaty musk filled his senses. Suddenly overcome by lust, he slid his hand down her naked belly, lower and lower, until his hand found the moist lips of her vagina. Rubbing his fingers gently but firmly over the folds of her labia, he whispered to her, "I know what you want of me. I will give it to you freely if you agree to aid us." The witch had closed her eyes and groaned as he had said this, and pressed her naked backside into him as he swirled his fingers in a rhythmic motion upon her pubis. Her breathing quickened, and after a moment of tensing, the witch swung her body around and began kissing Jacen passionately, as she had done before. Jacen pulled back his leggings and released his engorged penis from its caged prison. Pushing the woman back onto her back, Jacen placed the tip of his penis into the entrance to her labia and plunged into her. The witch arced her back and cried out in pleasure as Jacen rode her. Her legs twitched in orgasmic release as Jacen slid into and out of her repeatedly. His breathing was heavy, and he uttered a moan of pleasure. The witch suddenly sat up and pressed him back onto his back, causing his penis to momentarily pop out of her. Straddling his hips, she placed his throbbing vessel back into her vagina and began slowly riding him back and forth. Jacen reached up and squeezed her breasts firmly in his hands, bringing another shudder of release from the woman. As Jacen began to breathe heavier and heavier, the woman began chanting in an unknown language as she continued to ride him. Her words were dark and filled with the sounds of incantation as she reached her hand up into the air. She finished the words of the spell as Jacen reached his climax and placed her outstretched hand upon her abdomen as he expelled his seed deep within her. The witch cried out as he came into her and fell to climax once more before lying down upon his abdomen. Sighing in deep contentment, the nubile woman drew circular shapes upon his bare chest for a moment before lightly scratching her fingernails across his abdomen. After a time, Jacen stood up to take his leave and began to buckle his clothing back into place. The witch stretched up and leaned seductively upon the floor as she watched him dressed. "Stay," the woman intoned in a sound of quiet beseechment. Jacen paused, then looked upon her. With sudden compassion, he looked at the woman with new eyes and saw someone who was very lonely living in the forest alone. After a moment of consideration, he removed his clothing once more and lay down next to her. As he gathered her up into his arms, she snuggled in closer to him. "Just for a few hours," Jacen said, and the woman began kissing his chest. Jacen soon lifted her up and began kissing her passionate and long upon her mouth, reminding the witch of feelings she had not felt in over 1,000 years. She found herself kissing him back with equal passion, her plans for the child growing within her forgotten for the moment. General Hecate opened his eyes at dawn from the deep meditation he had begun 6 hours before. His body was relaxed and at rest, and his mind clear of all fear save the mission ahead of him this day. The lithe man stood up from his kneeling position and walked over to a mat that was placed at the center of his personal tent. He began running through several stretching routines that loosened the tightness in his hips from the long hours spent clearing his mind. Next, he began bending and flexing his form, focusing the microbes within him to strengthen his body. Soon his skin was as dense as stone, but as flexible as a reed. The glowing man walked over to the stand holding his armor and looked upon the gleaming silver material created by his brother Romero. Sliding the soft material over him, the material auto-shrunk around his body, molding into a tight glove around his agile and taut frame. The runes etched into the fabric glinted in a momentary reflection of fire from the nearby pit of flames that warmed the tent. Next, the general slid out his special double whip swords. Grasping the cylindrical and grooved handles of the swords, he held each of the thin, short weapons in a fighting pose and began a series of swinging swipes. Soon he was moving rapidly through a series of attacks, and a continuous metallic whirring and humming noise could be heard coming from within the tent. The superhuman man flicked the blades around him with extreme precision at a rapid speed. He came to a calm stop and looked upon the blades his brother had made for him so long ago. The general remembered the many times under his father's rule that he had used the swords during the time of rebuilding. Now he would use the weapons again, this time against his father, Cassius, and their twisted army. As he gazed upon the runes that were etched into the razor-sharp edge of the blades that never dulled, he marveled once again at his brother's great skill in weapon crafting. Long ago, his brother had experimented for 30 years and had finally come upon a manner of creating a near-unbreakable alloy that could withstand great frictional heat before breaking apart. Years later, he had somehow managed to work the strange metal into a thread and had built the armors from this special thread. In the years that had followed, he had perfected the skill to create an armor that was soft and pliant, as well as imbued with special harmonic energies that enhanced the wearer's movement. Sliding the swords into their scabbards upon his back, he only hoped his own skill at martial planning and execution would be as great as he picked up his flared, silver-white battle helmet and walked out of the tent. The long-lived general was met by his colonels who awaited in the dark of the nearby morning hours nearby his tent. Janae and Hope were there. They each carried one of their special bows upon their back and were also each wearing the custom armor made for them by Romero. Colonel Jacen stood nearby in his flame-colored armor and was holding his staff. Hecate noticed his flared helmet on his table nearby. Jacen was speaking with Captain Strone of his elite fighters who stood by him in similar-colored armor. Colonel Darstad stood near Jacen and was wearing his aqua blue-colored armor. Several vibronic force weapons adorned his belt, and he gave out commands to his personal aides that ran off to continue to help direct the next stage of attack. He, Jacen, and their men had arrived earlier in the day on Romero's large hovercraft and had given reports on the various success of their mission to recruit the specialty forces. As of yet, none of the special recruits had arrived to join in the fight. Colonel Cerebus stood by with no aid. He was wearing his darkened green-colored armor and holding the special poleaxe weapon in his dominant hand. Standing close by to Janae, he looked around at the ongoings around the group with interest and waved to people he knew with a grin as they passed by. The armor master Romero stood nearby with his back to the group. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he stood in a relaxed pose with his eyes closed. Hecate knew his brother was scanning the forest around him with his cybernetic sense as he approached the group and prepared to address his group of commanders. Walking over to the group, he said to them, "My friends, the day has come to bring the battle to my father's doorstep. If we are successful today, the Dark Lord's rule will end forever, and we will set up a new system of rule that is fair and just." The group listened to him silently, and the glowing man continued. "Our surveys report the remaining enemy's forces are encamped at the foot of the Dark Lord's stronghold. They number approximately 4,000 to our 1. We will attack them in 3 stages as we have trained for the last several weeks. Any unexpected changes will be handled by me personally, and everyone will stick to the plan that is set. There is no backup plan if we fail, but we will not try to fail." The members of the group looked at one another, and Hecate spoke once more. "Go now, we will execute stage 1 at first light in the encampment of our enemy," he commanded. The group members all ambled away to set up their specific plans. Darstad and Jacen chatted as they walked away. Then Darstad darted in and kissed Jacen on the mouth before moving away to command several aides to send out the message of impending attack. He could be seen donning his battle helmet and speaking out orders into the communication system built into it. His voice came over speakers that were built into the fortifications, and soon his orders were heard by all to rally for stage 1 of the assaults on the Dark Lord's forces. Janae watched Darstad kiss Jacen, and her heart momentarily clenched with the old pain. Cerebus stood nearby her and pretended not to notice the look on her face as he slid a finger tenderly under her chin and gently pulled her face to look at his. He said, "Hey, you keep your head in the game today." She smiled at him, and he leaned in to kiss her. Their lips met, and he held the kiss for a bit longer than normal before breaking off and moving away. Cerebus moved to put on his own battle helmet and walked away to prepare for his role in stage 2 of the battle plan. Janae watched her man walk away, then slowly looked away to stare again at Jacen, who was addressing his personal elite force some ways away. Ripping her gaze away and donning her own colonel's helmet, she strode away to where Hope was addressing the archers and giving last-minute orders. High Priest Cassius sat upon his borrowed dire steed at the back of his remaining army. The stump of his left arm was bandaged and wrapped underneath the armored gauntlet he now wore. He had lost the limb 3 months ago in a face-off with General Hecate. His beautiful home and city had fallen to the attacking resistance members, and he had escaped by boat with a few of the Legion commanders. Cassius gritted his teeth in anger at the memory of clutching his wounded arm to his chest as he rode upon the small fishing vessel they had commandeered after the brief battle with Hecate. He and several others had watched from the nearby boat as his beloved home and town had become sacked by the attacking resistance force. A final contingent of Black Warriors were routed and the city had fallen to the enemy. The Dark Lord had not been pleased at the loss of resources, and Cassius had screamed in agony for several hours as his master had assaulted his mind and body with waves of agonizing pain. Now he watched as the opposing force led their meager army into full view. Row after row of the enemy, set up in regiments, stood on the far hill across the plain in front of the Dark Lord's personal fortress. The flag of the new resistance could be seen fluttering in the dawn light. A black silk was emblazoned with an encircled dagger. Cassius felt a trembling of fear build in his stomach and fought a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. Hiding his true feeling beneath the armor he wore, he rode his dire steed to the front of the gathered platoons and addressed the 4,000 infantry members of the Black Warrior Legion assembled before him. Each platoon member wore the plate armor of the Dark Lord and carried a scabbarded short sword, spear, and buckler shield. A section of archers in special lightweight armor were also assembled here, as well as 80 individual Legion commanders who carried their focus weapons drawn and ready for battle. Cassius was about to address the men that stood before him when several of the Legion members began pointing at the trees that led to the nearby forest. The high priest turned and quietly breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the many men that had arrived to join his army. Walking toward the Legion members were 50 tribal forest dwellers. The strange warriors were armored in woven breastplates and carried wickedly long spears and daggers. Riding a wrapped horse at the head of the group was Clytus, the tribal chieftain, who was followed by 10 of his fellow dark shaman. Clytus and his special warriors joined the throng of men under Cassius. Cassius let the moment stand, then began to speak again. Just then a large cheer was heard across the field with the enemy. Cassius cursed at the second interruption and whipped his head around at the sound to see 50 large mutants join the ranks of the enemy. Even from his far-off vantage point, Cassius could see the large size of the mutants who had arrived and knew they would be deadly in the upcoming battle. Cassius reflected in disbelief as he had so many times recently how the resistance had beaten the blocked warriors so repeatedly. He anxiously awaited for the battle to begin so he could put his many failures behind him. Mustering up a commanding tone of voice, he addressed the Legion and reminded them of their oath to serve the Dark Lord in the coming battle. He repeated the lie of the promised land and riches that would be offered to the man who defeated any of the enemy champions. He finished the speech by pulling out his large short sword, pointing it at the enemy, and screaming, "No retreat! No mercy!" The Black Warriors all held their weapons high and gave a battle cry into the air. General Hecate listened to the speech with his cybernetic hearing from his position across the plain that would soon become a battlefield. He stood upon a raised dais that had been erected for him so that he might better witness the movements of his forces. He grinned as he heard the tremor in Cassius's voice and knew the man was frightened. The general turned to look at his brother Romero, who stood upon the ground nearby in standard cotton robes, and nodded at him. Romero grinned with a brotherly expression on his face and nodded back, indicating he had heard the tremor in the man's voice as well. Removing his focus from Cassius's weak speech, Hecate turned to Jacen, who stood by with his 20 elite fighters. Stage 1 of the plan was now set in motion, and he gave Jacen and Darstad the signals to execute. They both acknowledged him and issued orders to their various men. Darstad gave a loud command to the platoons of infantry under his command to begin marching towards the Black Warriors at a double-time pace. He looked at his men as they moved to obey his command. Each of the resistance wore the armor of Romero and were carrying the short swords made of the near-unbreakable metal. Each also carried a special buckler shield attached to their wrist. Jacen led his elite guards spread throughout the standard infantry, and Hecate could see their uniquely colored armor and weapons glinting in the morning light as they marched toward the impending fight. The 50 mutants that had arrived joined the marching infantry and lumbered toward the ranks of the Black Warriors. Each heavily muscled man was carrying a wickedly large forest spear. Janae and Hope positioned 100 of their archers behind the infantrymen, with the remaining 50 hiding in the forest for the second phase of the attack. Cerberus and his cavalry lay hidden for the same plan. Darstad noted the position of the Legion commanders in the enemy army and called out a change in position over the communication system. Instantly, the marching platoons divided into groups of wedge-shaped phalanxes and continued their movements toward the enemy. Cassius witnessed the reforming infantrymen moving toward his army at speed, and with another tremor in his voice, gave the command to attack. The legion moved to obey, with all legion commanders issuing orders to the men under their command. Now the large army of the Dark Lord began moving to intercept the resistance force, and soon both armies were running at each other, hollering a battle cry. The two groups met at the center of the plain with a loud crash as the sounds of melee fighting, screams from wounded men, and battle cries were heard. Janae gave her command to open fire, and a hail of arrows rained down upon the enemy, causing many Black Warrior infantrymen to lay upon the ground, with the arrows of the resistance piercing through their armor, and small explosions of fire and metal pressing hot shrapnel into the advancing ranks. The Black Warriors returned fire from their own archers, and although one or two arrows found their mark, most of the arrows glanced ineffectively off the superior armor of Romero. Several of the special explosives were thrown by the resistance members, and the battle began to be marked with the periodic sounds of explosions. The special explosives concussed the Dark Warriors and allowed for the smaller force to create confusion in the large ranks of the enemy. The resistance was gaining ground against the infantry of the Dark Lord. Jacen and his elite moved through the enemy, pushing back and killing many of the Dark Warriors. After a moment, Cassius ordered several more platoons into the fighting. The Legion commanders also joined the fight, and soon the arcane humming of their focus weapons could be heard. Dark lines of force were seen to rip into the Resistance's advancing forces. Several of the Resistance members at the front line were cut down or sent flying back by the terrible energy of the weapons. Darstad had been expecting this and gave the secret command to counteract the terrible weapons. At his command, several of the infantrymen locked their special buckler shields together into a makeshift barrier. As the arcane lines of force struck the barrier, the men were pushed back and heavily concussed, but the strange metal of the shields created by Romero dissipated the worst of the strange energy, and no one was fatally injured. The reserve infantry cried out in triumph that the plan had worked, and soon the advancing resistance force began attacking the Black Warrior Legion with renewed vigor. The mutants were deadly, and swiped their long spears and hammers in great arcs, slamming the weapons against the armor of the Dark Warriors. The armor prevented any major damage from occurring, but so great was the strength of the mutant men that several armor pieces crimped under the impact of the great weapons. The mutants gave a great howl as they attacked, and several of the Dark Warriors were stymied by the guttural roaring from the cancer-ridden men. Jacen and his fighters attacked like caged animals, and no Black Warrior could harm any of the elite warriors. Cassius cursed as he saw the tide of the battle already shifting against him, and ordered the entire remaining platoons to attack. Soon, all was chaos as the relatively few resistance members were surrounded by the greater numbers of the Dark Warrior Legion. Just then, Hecate gave the order to execute Stage 2 of the attack. At his command, the remaining archers appeared from the forest and began shooting their deadly arrows at the unprotected flank of the encroaching dark forces. Cerberus simultaneously led a cavalry charge down upon the Dark Warriors, taking many out of the fight by merely slamming their armored rapt horses against the men from behind and trampling them underneath armored hooves. His deadly poleaxe weapon sliced down left and right from his position on the rapt horse, cutting through limbs and armor with equal ease. The horrified Dark Warriors fell back despite the screams of their Legion commanders to press forward and attack. And soon, Cerberus had created a wedge into the mass of legionnaires and halted the advance as they were forced to deal with this new threat. His remaining cavalry continued to pummel their animals through the ranks of the Dark Warriors, riding in at speed, swiping their weapons right and left, only to pull away and ride back in for another charge. Many of the Legion commanders were killed in the onslaught, and large groups of Dark Warriors milled around in confusion. Cassius saw the end of the battle approaching and shouted out to Clytus to use the shamans. Clytus gave his acknowledgement and nodded to his 10 shaman, who spread out and began chanting in a dark and foul-sounding language. Across the field, Jacen's senses screamed out at him, and he finished pulling the pointed side of his staff weapon out from a Dark Warrior's chest to search for the cause of his disquiet. Suddenly, he felt several demons enter his plane of existence as strangely colored dimensional pockets began opening from one realm to theirs. Jacen momentarily staggered as he sensed the creatures that began to appear. The resistance members fell back as the temperature plummeted and dimensional doorways opened right onto the plane of battle. An army of hulking and tall demons carrying nightmare melee weapons stepped out of the apertures and began roaring in demonic unison as they swiped their massive weapons left and right. The many horned beasts were each over 7 feet tall, heavily muscled, and red-skinned. Jacen ran over to one of the evil creatures and engaged it in battle. Upon his approach, the creature moved backwards and seemed unsure of itself or what to do. Jacen used its immobility to attack and soon swept the heavy creature from its feet, where it fell to the ground with a loud crash. Several of his elite fighters took out daggers and stabbed the roaring creature repeatedly until it was no longer moving. After a moment, the dark creature spontaneously caught on fire and quickly burned to ash. Jacen set off to attack another of the large creatures, and it too shied away from him as he approached and was soon struck down and stabbed by his honor guard. Jacen continued moving along the battlefield, periodically blocking attacks from Dark Warrior infantry that still fought in the chaos that was now everywhere upon the battle plain. Other members of the resistance force did not fare as well against the nightmare creatures and began to shiver uncontrollably from the sudden freezing temperature. The large demons were nearly unstoppable with their great strength and weapons, and the battle was slowly turning against the resistance members. Hecate released both of his whip swords from his scabbards and was about to jump into the fighting when Romero spoke to him and said, "Brother, look!" He was pointing at the edge of the forest where 5 of the recruited occult users could be seen chanting and pointing in the direction of the fighting. The Witch of the East stood among them with several dark-robed acolytes guarding her with stone daggers. As the witch and the others of her kind began to chant, a warm wind began blowing, counteracting the cold of the demons and allowing the affected infantry to fight unhindered once again. Loud popping noises were heard, and the ground around many of the fighting Dark Warriors began rupturing as large sinkholes formed in their midst. The sinkholes began sucking many of the warriors down, screaming into the newly formed pits, where they were soon covered by tons of falling debris. Several other fighters found the ground beneath them turning into a type of muddy sand that hindered their movements, and soon any advancements was halted by the gooey substance. A strange buzzing sound was heard, and thousands of locusts began flying from the forest trees to land upon the fighting warriors, who began screaming and beating at the biting insects that covered them. Jacen looked over at the arrival of the witch and her accomplices and gave a wave of thanks. The heavily pregnant witch blew a kiss at him, then returned to her chanting. Cassius saw the tide turning against he and his forces once again and threw himself into the fight as his shaman wrestled to summon more demonic energies. Drawing out a great two-handed sword and using the special technologies within his armor, Cassius leapt high into the air to come down in the middle of many fighters. His movements knocked everyone, his own men included, back from the impression he made on the ground where he had landed. Instantly, several resistance members began attacking him, but their swords could not penetrate his special armor that had been created by the Dark Lord himself, and their unique blades created screeching noises as they glanced off the gold-colored metal. The armored man began to swing his great two-handed sword around him to crash into the resistance members nearest him. Romero's armor held, but so great was the strength of impact from Cassius's mechanized armor that the armor of Romero would bend and crack when struck by the High Commander's large weapon. His attacks caused significant impact trauma to the stricken warriors. As one resistance member after another fell to Cassius, Hecate launched himself into the fight and began running at great speed towards the armored man. Several Dark Warriors were in his path, and using his 2 whip swords, he batted these men out of his way, or cut deep gashes into their unprotected regions as he ran past. 30 Dark Warriors fell in unison as the cybernetic human ran past and cut them with his deadly swords. Cassius was just stabbing his large sword through the arm of a resistance member when Hecate arrived and swiped his swords at Cassius's armored back. The priest's armor was heavily scored by the attack, but held as Cassius was knocked several feet forward by Hecate's momentum. Cassius recovered and turned around only to meet a flurry of stabs, swipes, and cuts from the general's 2 weapons. Cassius deflected as many of the attacks as he could, but Hecate was soon moving through a series of combinations that were too fast for the man to follow. Finally, Hecate was able to cut the high priest's remaining hand from his body, causing the man to fall to his knees with a scream. With several repeated swipes of his swords, Hecate cut the man's helmet away, then cleanly decapitated the man. His swords had become a hot orange color and began to cool as the lifeless body fell to the ground, to gush a purple-colored blood upon the ground. The resistance force gave a great cheer as Hecate defeated the high priest, and the remaining legion commanders began giving the order to fall back and retreat to the stronghold. Soon the entire legion was in full retreat, and the remaining 2,000 Dark Warriors that had survived were fleeing the field in the direction of the great structure that stood before everyone. The group of shamans uttered guttural words in their secret language, and the hulking demonic creatures provided a bastion of protection as they all moved in the direction of the large fortress that loomed against the mountain range behind them. Hecate cleaned his 2 swords of blood and returned them to his scabbards as he watched the hulking demons walking away and the remaining dark warriors retreating. As the surviving resistance members around him cheered, Hecate knew the battle had just begun as they regrouped and approached the outskirts of the great stronghold of his father, Jacob Magnus Riley, also known as the Dark Lord. Hecate summoned his colonels and their aides together and executed Stage 3 of their attack. The 2 small mortar cannon that had been built by Hecate were removed from their hiding spots and were in the process of being wheeled into position at the base of the stronghold, where the remaining block warriors had gathered en masse with the remnants of the legion commanders and shamans. Hecate listened to the reports from his colonels and calculated the losses. The armorcraft and weaponry of Romero had held true, as they had only lost 200 infantrymen, archers, and cavalry to almost half of the enemy. As the remaining 800 resistance members moved together toward the base of the stronghold, the groups of men and women fighters felt excited as they realized they were reaching the final phase of the battle. Many cried out a battle cry as they walked in victory toward the end of the old ruler. As his forces pressed forward, General Hecate looked upon the great stronghold of his father and remembered the many years he himself had lived at the fortress and where he had commanded the early militia. He had not looked upon the fortress for over 100 years and saw many new structures built around the outskirts of the metallic castle. He looked and recalled there had once been a small outlier village that led to a granite courtyard and a display of small fountains of water and lighted artistic sculptures. Now there stood a 15-foot metallic wall. A large metallic door stood at the center of the wall, and a perimeter of land dotted with various piles of debris and blinking lights led away from the once grand structure. Hecate still remembered the day he had first been to the beautiful castle his father had built in preparation for the great destruction that had followed his actions so long ago. His heart lurched in despair at the current state of the fortress and vowed to himself to restore it to its former glory. As the general looked upon the fortress, 2 turrets rose up out of hidden sheaths built into the outer walls of the stronghold. Hecate called for his forces to halt and take cover, as he was uncertain what weaponry might still exist after so many years away from his old command base. The 2 turrets suddenly started emitting a high-pitched whining noise, and everyone that was caught within the range of the weapon suddenly doubled over or fell upon the ground, overcome with nausea. Cerberus still rode upon his rapt horse and was outside the range of the strange echoing weapon, and ordered his men to stay back from the section of men who had fallen to the ground. Janae and Hope's archers had been split, with one group getting hit by the sound effect of the weapon and the other group outside its range of effect. Hope watched helplessly as Janae and her archers all fell to the ground in disorientation from the effects of the strange wailing devices. Jacen and his honor guard were in the process of regrouping and were still outside the range of the devices. He looked at the large groups of his fighters falling to the ground, then saw that Janae and her archers had gotten caught by the weapon. The young colonel immediately began running toward his estranged friend with the intent of helping her. His group of elite forces ran after their leader to protect him. Darstad was giving orders to the few men that were unaffected by the weapon and told everyone to take cover. He was near Jacen when he saw his lover running toward Janae and called out for him to stop. Chasing after his lover, the colonel followed in worried pursuit. Many of the Black Warrior Legion were caught in the sound blast from the strange weapon and similarly fell over, clutching their hands over their ears. Hecate ran over to one of the cannons whose operators had fallen to the ground as the high-pitched undulating sound from the turrets continued to blare out against the fighters. Hecate took aim with one of the cannon weapons and ignited the charge that would send the massive projectile at his target. The projectile blasted away in an explosion of sound, and the large circular projectile flew to strike the wall next to one of the turrets. Upon impact, the turret gave a sputter of sparks and electrical discharges and fell silent. The portion of resistance members that were closest to the damaged weapon soon recovered and shook their heads clear of the effects of the weapon. After a moment, the large contingent of resistance fighters continued their advance toward the awaiting demons, block warriors, and legion commanders. The remaining turret continued to wail its strange noise, and Hecate turned the cannon over to one of the operators, who stood up with blood running from his ears. Grabbing a canteen filled with water, the general splashed the man in the face and directed the disoriented mortar specialist to blast the weapon at the remaining turret. The water had been effective, and the specialist shook his head clear and began the slow process of loading the cannon for another shot. Hecate spread the word to the other cannon operatives, and soon the 2 cannons were slowly exploding shot, one by one, at the walls and the Black Warriors. One of the cannons successfully took out the remaining turret, and the awful noise fell silent, allowing those affected by the strange noise to recover. The mortar specialists began their process of firing, then reloading the cannon only to fire once again. Several of the exploding cannon shot ripped into the Black Warriors, sending body parts and scorched armor flying in all directions. In the ongoing chaos of battle, Jacen arrived to Janae's position. His men arrived soon after and took up defensive positions around the group. The young bowmaster was shaking her head clear of the strange echoing weapon. She and her other archers were positioned out of the main fight, but within shooting range, and one by one were standing up and shaking off the effects of the turret weapon that had been destroyed. Jacen pulled off his helmet and grabbed Janae into an embrace as he shouted over the din of fighting that was beginning at the base of the stronghold a short distance away. "Are you okay?" he shouted to her. Janae looked back at him with a shell-shocked expression. Blood ran from both of her ears in a small trickle that ran down her neck on each side. After a moment, she nodded, and Jacen pulled out a canteen of water and gave it to her. Janae drank from the canteen as the intensity of the fighting picked up once again. Just then, Darstad arrived and saw Jacen putting on his helmet as Janae drank from a canteen. Janae's archers were regrouping and began sending in volleys of arrows into the retreating Black Warriors. Looking quickly around the small group, Darstad saw they were in no immediate danger and saw the mortar group had begun to use the two cannons in a concentrated attack that was effectively scything down the enemy with each blast from the loud bursting weapons. Just then, another weapon came into view from behind the large wall of the stronghold. Hecate saw and recognized the great pointed weapon coming into view and quickly shouted an order for everyone to take cover. With a scream of scorching atmosphere, a bright red beam of pointed light erupted from the weapon and lanced out twice to strike each of the resistance cannons. Both weapons were vaporized into a slag of running metal as the beam cut into the two weapons. One mortar specialist gave a momentary scream as the beam sliced into his body in the attack. The specialist's deceased form fell to the ground with a charred and bloody hole where his face and upper torso had been, and was soon covered in the molten hot run of metallic liquid that had once been the cannon. The beam weapon fell silent, and the resistance rallied to fall back from their individual spots of cover when a shimmering blue energy bubble suddenly appeared over the entire stronghold. Hecate was expecting this and used the internal communication system to give the order for Jacen and his team to move in with the thrown explosives. Several enthusiastic resistance members ignored the blue energy bubble and ran towards it against orders, overcome in the heat of battle. These few unfortunate souls ran full speed into the equivalent of a dense wall and fell to the ground twitching as the bones of their face or skull were crushed. Hecate shook his head at the stupidity of the runners and watched as Jacen and his team of specialists moved into position. Jacen gave Janae a quick hug, then moved out with his elite team. He and his team took up strategic positions and began throwing the special explosives at the junctions between the energy bubble and the energy emitters that were broadcasting from positions in the stronghold wall. Eventually, enough of the emitters were destroyed, and a crack opened into the energy dome, allowing enough room for up to 5 men to move through it. The resistance force surged toward the opening, which was blocked on the other side by the remaining blocked warriors and demons. Just then, the resistance members closest to the breach were violently struck back, and several men went flying through the air by the force of the impact. Standing at the breach were 12 warriors, all wearing black tunics that held numbers upon their breast. Each of the new warriors were tall and powerful, and wore no armor but carried a variety of large, two-handed melee weapons. As each resistance fighter would run up to the strange warrior, the warrior would react with great speed and strike the oncoming attacking opponent. One resistance member was batted away by one of the new warriors, and his armor was crushed inward by the impact. The fighter fell upon the ground lifeless, with a stream of blood jettisoning out of his mouth by the force of the impact from the numbered warrior who had struck him. Another resistance fighter had an arm cut away, only to be stabbed in the chest by the giant spear of the strange warrior who wielded it. Several resistance members were able to cut into these strange warriors with their swords. The stricken warriors would stagger, then right themselves and continue fighting as if nothing had occurred. Soon these 12 warriors had pushed back all resistance members from the breach and were now guarding it, fighting against any that approached. Looking upon the 12 forms with his special vision, Hecate whispered, "Father, what have you done?" and ran off at speed to intercept the strange warriors one-on-one. The blocked warriors and hulking demons fell back as the 12 warriors pressed forward into the breach of the blue energy screen. Just as another resistance member fell to the giant spear weapon of one of the strange warriors, Hecate launched himself through the breach at the closest of the numbered warriors and attacked him with his 2 whip swords. The warrior was pushed back by the momentum of Hecate's attack. Running through a flurry of combinations with the swords, Hecate had soon covered the repulsed warrior with 50 cuts to his face and torso, causing the man to fall upon the ground in a bleeding mass of wounds. Hecate stepped over the falling form, but was grabbed by the ankle by the man he had just cut down. Incredulously, Hecate looked down and saw the cuts disappearing from the man's face and torso as accelerated healing took place. The warrior released Hecate's ankle and blocked a wild swipe that Hecate brought down to decapitate the strange man, while simultaneously leaping backward to land upon his feet and kick out at Hecate. The general lithely blocked the kick, but was pushed back by the force of the impact. Hecate's mind quickly calculated the strength required to execute the movement he had just witnessed when all 12 of the strange numbered warriors moved in and began attacking him in unison. As the warriors brought up their weapons and attacked, Hecate became a blur of movement, blocking and swiping at any attack that came at him from the numbered warriors. The resistance members closest to the battle cried out their encouragement to the attacking general and raised their hands and weapons as they cheered. Those that could not see the attack heard the constant and steady sound of metal striking metal as Hecate warded off the attacking 12 warriors. From the far side of the battle, Romero calmly watched his brother sublimely ward off every attack from the numbered warriors. The armor master watched his brother, who was the epitome of movement, his swords creating a melody of clanging sound as he struck the enemy over and over. Hecate struck the weapons against the strange warriors so fast that the metal of his two swords began to create a loud, ongoing, whirring noise. For a split second, Romero saw his brother shoot him an imploring expression at a moment in the fight against the creatures. Romero's heart was torn, as he had sworn never to fight again after the great tragedy that he had caused so many years ago. But as he watched his brother fight the strange warriors that never seemed to tire, he saw it was only a matter of time until he would not be able to fully defend himself. In a frozen moment of time, Romero remembered a lifetime of experiences with his younger brother and was suddenly moved to intervene on his behalf. With a great battle cry, Romero launched himself toward his brother at incredible speed. As he ran, he swiped the flared pole axe weapon away from Cerberus, causing the cavalryman to fall to the ground with a curse. Just as one of the 12 new warriors was bringing his weapon down on Hecate's unprotected back, an explosion of sound and kinetic energy was caused by Romero as he landed next to the fighting men and knocked the 12 strange fighters back. One of the warriors recovered and ran at the newcomer, who immediately moved in to intercept the attacker. Using the archaic poleaxe weapon in a series of swipes, the attacking man was soon cut into several pieces, with his head and a large portion of his torso cut away. The two brothers began to fight the tireless attackers back to back and began pushing the strange warriors away. Working together, one by one, the 12 warriors were each eventually decapitated, but the bodies continued to move in a directionless way, grabbing at whatever the decapitated form would come near to. With Hecate and Romero guarding the beheaded bodies, several resistance members ran up and successfully hacked the arms and legs away from the beheaded creatures. Upon Hecate's orders, the pieces of the strange warriors were each gathered and placed in individual burlap sacks, covered in pitch, and set afire. Hecate looked around, then nodded in an old-fashioned way to his brother, who nodded back at him. The blocked warriors and demons gave a roar and began advancing back toward the resistance force. As the enemy moved in, Hecate ran through the breach in the nearby energy field and began engaging any of the dark warriors he encountered. Using his two swords, he cut a swath through the infantrymen, causing their bodies to fly backwards, such was the force of his blows. Hecate began laughing as he attacked the men, and the sound was loud and chilling to the dark warriors he encountered. Men fell to the ground as great wounds appeared in their torso, due to their armor having been cut in twain by the force of Hecate's attacks. The remaining members of the Black Warrior Legion began falling back at the sound of laughter coming from the mad fighter that moved through their ranks like a mist. Soon, only the hulking demons were willing to fight the glowing man, and one by one, the demons were directed by their controllers to leap upon the glowing figure that moved like lightning from one spot to the next. His efforts were worth it, as more and more of the remaining resistance members were now able to pour through the opening, including Jacen, his elite fighters, Janae and her archers, Hope, and Darstad. Jacen and his elite team engaged the infantrymen nearest to them and began cutting their way deep into the armored men's ranks. Their movements widened the opening in the breach further, allowing more of the resistance members to pour through. Picking up a pair of fallen resistance swords from the ground, Cerberus jumped through the breach and began hacking left and right at the nearest blocked warriors he encountered. Although it was difficult to see in the confusion and fighting, Janae, Hope, and the other remaining archers began firing their deadly missiles into the enemy or the demonic creatures that continued to fight. Romero walked calmly around the fighting mass of men around him, seemingly out for a stroll. With detached calm, he effortlessly blocked any attack that came his way by subtly moving his body or using the flared poleaxe to bat an attack away. His movements and momentum carried him on, and no one else was attacked or killed by him. Soon, this tall, glowing man arrived upon a hill overlooking a battle where his brother Hecate was advancing against the bulk of the armored enemy. To Romero's cybernetically enhanced vision, his brother appeared to be a whirling set of blades that danced in the middle of a press of ants that surrounded him on all sides. He could hear his brother laughing in delight, and a small grin appeared on the older brother's lips as he watched his brother take on the full army of his father. In addition to laughter, great shouts were heard coming from the epicenter of the whirling dervish of blades that was the man Hecate, and bodies of men would be seen to go flying, repulsed back from the effects of the Omegan's battle cries. The Black Warrior Legion continued to fight against Hecate and other resistance fighters while the remaining demons engaged all around them. There were still a few enemy archers who were sending arrows from their places of cover. Romero glanced to his left and saw Jacen spinning his staff and striking an attacking enemy in the chest with a great burst of sound from his mouth. Darstad was near him, holding two glowing vibro force weapons in his hands and was repeatedly sending out bursts of force from each weapon. Those enemies that came against him were repulsed back by the power of his focused energy weapons to fall crushed and lifeless upon the ground. As he casually swatted an arrow from its flight at his head with the poleaxe, the cybernetic man looked around and eventually found the archers Janae and Hope, calmly taking aim and shooting into the mass of fighters. Several other archers still lived and shot into the mass of Black Warriors. Romero's cybernetic mind quickly calculated that it was only a matter of time. With a rare chuckle, he realized they had done it. Just then, the cybernetic man heard a humming noise on the ground and looked down to see an exposed piece of cable lying open on the ground. Examining the cable with his enhanced vision, Romero realized he stood at a power conduit and quickly striped the poleaxe blade through 3 feet of ground at his feet. The cable was completely severed, and the blue energy bubble that remained shimmered out of existence. The remaining resistance members gave a great cheer as the energy dome buzzed out of existence. Just then, a large door in the middle of the wall of the stronghold opened. A crying laughter was heard booming, and all the fighting paused at the sound of the strange laughter. Everyone turned toward the door. A large dark opening beckoned for a moment, and then framed in the darkness stood the Dark Lord. All fighting fell quiet as the man appeared to float above the pathway in the direction of the fighters. The glowing being was well over 6 feet tall and had the facial appearance of a man who was in his late 50s. Strange protuberances grew about his face and brow, and he wore a blindfold over his eyes. His form was strangely muscled, and his deeply muscled body shimmered with a continuous red glow. His floating form stopped when it reached the closest fighters, and everyone immediately shambled away from the floating figure due to the intense heat that was emanating from the being. Hecate looked upon his father, and his mind took in the strange colored glow that ran about his form, and noted the strange protuberances that appeared to have grown onto the man's face. Jacen looked upon the floating form and wondered at the being he had heard so much of, but had never seen with his own eyes. Darstad looked at the floating creature, then looked away in fear as the old promises of terror came flooding back into his memory. Romero looked upon his father with revulsion and understanding as he realized why his father appeared in the manner which he did. Seeing that everyone's attention was on the large being that hovered above them, Janae picked up her bow, took a careful aim, and launched her flying arrow directly at the floating figure. The arrow struck the creature directly in the face, but glanced away to fall to the ground as if it had struck some impenetrable barrier. Moving its head slowly side to side, the being looked about itself, and its face fell in the direction of Janae. The creature sniffed at her, then reached out a clenched fist in her direction. Janae suddenly screamed as she was lifted from her location to hover over the heads and bodies of warriors all around her. Hope cried out and jumped up to grab Janae, but was slammed backwards by an invisible force. Her body was flung to the ground, and she landed on her arm, which bent at an odd angle with a loud snap. The young captain moaned as several of her team ran forward to help her. The Dark Lord turned away and began to return to the stronghold with Janae somehow in tow, both floating through the air. Seeing his old friend being taken away by the dark being, Jacen ripped away his helmet and cried out, "Janae!" Batting his way through the stunned warriors around him, Jacen tore after the floating man in the direction of the vast stronghold. Cerberus cried out, "No!" as Janae was taken away by the Dark Lord. Darstad cried out, "Jacen!" and ran after his lover, slicing his focus weapons left and right into the ranks of the enemy as he ran. The floating being re-entered the opening of the great doorway, which began to close behind him. Hecate cried out, "Jacen, wait!" And all was confusion as the fighters of the opposing armies began their attack against each other once more. Hecate began attacking the enemies closest to him, trying to clear a path to his running pupil. Romero stood stunned upon the hillside, replaying the scene he had just witnessed with his cybernetically enhanced memory. The protuberances, the apparent floating, the heat. His mind calculated all possibilities and rapidly came to the most logical conclusion. Romero began running with great speed after Jacen and Darstad. He called out in a loud and booming voice, "Hecate!" The whirling movement that was the man Hecate paused in his fight at the great cry that came from his brother. Hecate saw the direction his brother was running towards, calculated the best method to rendezvous, and set off at a powerful run to meet his brother. Soon the two cybernetic men ran next to each other with great speed after Jacen, Darstad, and the creature that had once been their father. As they ran, Romero said, "Did you see?" "I saw," interrupted Hecate. "We have to." "I know," interrupted Hecate. The two brothers both set their brow into a state of flow, intent on completing the new mission before them, to destroy the man they had once called father. Cerberus saw Hecate and Romero running away from the battle and shouted, "Wait!" but was suddenly drawn into another battle with the seemingly unending tide of armored dark warriors around him. The numbers were thinning on both sides, and soon 1,500 of the dark warriors still fought on with 5 of the shamans and several hulking demons. They began to surround the remaining 500 resistance members that were made up of infantrymen, archers, members of Jacen's elite, the mutants, the occultists, and cavalry. The archers' arrows were now spent, and they began picking up arrows they could find on the ground to shoot. Many began drawing out daggers to engage in close-up fighting. The resistance pushed on and continued their attack while the sounds of fighting, screaming, and demonic shouts covered the battle plain. Just then, a trumpet sounded loudly, and 1,000 farmers, led by Guy, Euclidean, and Chino, were seen screaming and running from the nearby woods at the fighting blocked warriors. Cerberus finished swiping a sword thrust across an enemy and looked up with surprise to see his former companions running towards him. They each wore the old leather forest armors and carried the leaf-shaped short swords that were given to them from before. The many farmers that ran to join the fight wore a mixed match of various armors, and with a chuckle, Cerberus realized it must be the armor the group had once hidden in the story Janae had told him about on their early adventure together. The new fighters slashed the morale of the enemy as they turned to engage the oddly clad farmers. More arrows began to be fired into the dark warriors from the new arrivals, and Cerberus ran over to hug Euclidean. Embracing the tall ebony-skinned man and giving Chino a grin, he said, "I am so glad to see the two of you." The tall fighter laughed, then cried out, "Look out!" Cerberus turned just as a demon reared up and brought his club in a smashing blow at the two men, who dodged out of the way. The creature bellowed and clumsily swung its weapon in a swipe at Cerberus, who jumped over the club at the last moment and rolled away. The creature screamed a great bellow of rage and ran after Cerberus, who began screaming in a high-pitched voice and running away from it. Euclidean watched him running away and laughed at the running man screaming. "I've missed this," he cried out, then jumped into the fray of fighting men around him.